Hi, and welcome to another podcast in our Zero Carbon 2030 series. I'm Fraser Durham from Argand Solutions, and today we're going to be talking about how to utilize and optimize and enable private wire connections. It's one of the things that we think is going to be absolutely huge over the next sort of 10, 20 years, especially if we're going to use all of our generation assets optimally. So at the moment, imagine that you're a renewable energy developer, maybe you are one, and essentially if you think about the last 10 years, we've got a portfolio of assets across the UK and also the world of solar and wind, and a lot of this is just sitting there and it's exporting to the grid and it's providing electricity to the grid, but that's all that it's doing. Now, imagine that those assets, some of them are actually going to be relatively close to local industrial sites. And so the opportunity is really to connect these assets up with local demand and to then enable the generation asset owners to enhance their income from power purchase agreements or PPAs, and then also for the local demand to essentially purchase energy at a better rate than maybe they're buying it at the moment. So, I mean, just to put that all in context, at the moment, if you're exporting electricity to the grid in the UK, typically you're going to be receiving between £50 and £60 per megawatt hour for that energy. And if you're buying energy as a commercial or industrial client, overall, maybe you're going to be paying in the order of, say, £120 a megawatt hour. So if you can get a PPA where you can sort of get that energy to flow between the two sites at, say, £80 or £90 a megawatt hour, then basically everybody is making money. It makes economic sense, and you're actually using that energy much more locally. And it's sort of, we think, a really important part of the puzzle to achieve zero carbon. So if you're going to do that, very briefly, you're going to need to sort of overcome a number of sort of high-level things. Number one is that the DNO has very specific regulations around how things can be connected to the grid. And so certainly what you're going to need if you're going to do a private wire is to make sure that that private wire doesn't allow electricity to flow from one grid connection point to another grid connection point via the private wire. So you're going to need control sitting in there to manage and meet the DNO regulations. The other thing that's going to be critical in these kind of private wire developments, especially as we get more and more distributed generation, is that typically the demand site will have an export limit or a G100 regulation imposed on it. And that needs to be managed by any solution that you're going to put for the private wire. Thirdly, you're also going to need to sort of optimize the revenue between the PPA and the export price for the generation asset owner. So there are sort of a lot of dynamic sort of changes occurring. We'll sort of unpack those very shortly. But basically, you're going to have to manage where you're connected to according to the fluctuating demand and generation profiles. And finally, what you do want to do is you want to sort of make sure that this whole system is not switching continuously between the different sides, so you're not sort of creating something that's going to fail through physical wear and tear at the end of, after a very short period of time. So, sounds challenging, it is, and let's just unpack some of those sort of points that we just raised before. So the key thing here is that you can't just plug a private wire between a generation asset and a demand asset. The reason being that if you put that wire in, you'd effectively have a kind of a circular flow of energy where electricity could sort of flow from one grid connection through the private wire into the and out of the other grid connection. And so if you had an engineer, imagine at one site, they think they've shut it down, they're about to sort of go in there and do some maintenance, but essentially it's still live because electricity could be flowing into that site from the other grid connection that they're not aware of. So what has to happen with any private wire is basically it can only be connected to one grid connection or the other at any moment in time to meet the DNO's requirements or network requirements. So that means that basically you're going to need a control system to manage that kind of shifting from one to the other and never allowing energy at any moment in time to be able to flow between the two. The second thing with this, I mean, old private wires that were put in place used to have, Castell key interlocks. So literally, when you wanted to switch from one site to the other, somebody had to go out to site and sort of turn a big key in a big piece of switchgear. That's clearly not going to enable a zero carbon future when we've got all these different things happening. It will have to be dynamic. So this control system that sits between the generation asset and the demand asset has to be able to control the connection dynamically and switch between it depending on whatever logic is required. And so what that means is that essentially there are a number of things it needs to look at. It needs to look at, firstly, the economic value. So when is it economically viable to be connected to the export connection versus the PPA connection? And that is made more complex by the fact that if you've got a G100 restriction at the demand side, then essentially you're having to sort of make a calculation as to if the constrained generation from the G100 versus reduced demand, at what point are you making less money on the PPA connection than if you were to export? So you need to be able to switch between those and say, actually, I'm going to make more money from this connection or that connection, and make sure that that's done optimally and that logic is continually updated dependent on different circumstances. The other thing that's also quite interesting is, the breaking up of renewable assets into different fractions so that actually it's not all or nothing. There may be different portions of your renewable asset. So if you had a 50 megawatt solar PV site, you may say, actually, I just want 10 megawatts to be split off. So we'll throw 10 megawatts into this site. And then when their demand increases above 10 megawatts, we'll put the next 10 megawatts into that site, or smaller portions. So again, you can also look at trying to split your generation up. Again, all of this comes with, the more complexity, there's more cost. So you also have to find that balance point whereby the solution for these private wires is economically feasible and meets, for a specified level of complexity. So, basically, with this zero carbon target that everyone's talking about, so the government's talking about 2050. It's sort of regulated. It's sort of stated that that's what we need to do. Now, we think that timeline should be brought forward. But either way, there is significant investment that's going to occur going forward in new assets, into trillions of dollars, annually across the globe. But it's not just about new assets. Just to reiterate this, it's also about existing assets. So if you know of large-scale generation assets sitting, exporting straight to the grid, and you know that they're close to industrial or commercial sites, you need to be thinking, can I get a private wire between those? Because there is an opportunity there. And the same if you're a large demand client and you can see a wind turbine or some solar that's sort of 1 kilometre or 2 kilometres away. This is all still possible, and you need to be sort of thinking about what you can do. And certainly, give us a call at Argand Solutions, and we can sort of have a chat about whether it's possible to solve. So, with all of this in mind, what we've done over the last sort of year or so is we've built and successfully achieved a kind of DNO-approved connection agreement for a fully automated private wire control system. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially what we've been talking about, a control system that will sit between the generation asset and the demand asset, will meet all of the DNO requirements, will manage G100 requirements, can build in the economic logic that we were talking about. So we're really sort of excited by this development, and we really think that, the private wire market, both in the UK and overseas, is really, really going to be an important one over the next 5 to 10 years. We've got a number of projects in the UK that are currently being developed using this technology. And, if you've got a project, you've got an idea, or you just want to have a chat about it, we'd love to hear from you and give you a bit more information about these projects and about how we can solve these kind of problems. So if you'd like to hear more, please give us a call. My name's Fraser Durham. You can call me or the team on UK 01803 864 706. And, just get in touch. And thank you very much for listening to this brief podcast on private wires, part of our Zero Carbon 2030 series. Thanks a lot.
Podcasting for brands. I am the hound.com.